I know we'll have some more members that'll probably be showing up momentarily, but our original start time was noon today and or upon adjournment. So we've reached that time. I'm gonna ask everybody to kind of wind down their conversations. Representative Kelly is going to open us up in a word of prayer, and we'll try to get to our business today. Representative Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Everybody bow your heads. Dear God, we just want to thank you for this day, dear Lord. We want to thank you for the opportunity you give us to serve the citizens of this great state, Father. We know it's a tremendous honor and opportunity to get to do so, Father. So we thank you. God, we just ask you'll give us wisdom as we consider bills today, and we ask that you'll just give us the wisdom to make the right decisions, Father. We ask you just constantly remind us, Father, that even in our disagreements, Father, that we're all still your children. God, watch over us and guide us through the rest of the day. Be with those who aren't with us. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Representative Kelly. Just to kind of lay out what we're going to be looking at today, we have 3 Senate bills on the agenda, and then we have the Department of Audits along with some of our researchers across the state that performed some of our audits this past year to kind of go through and explain those in a little bit greater detail and take a few questions if there are any. Senator Hickman, I noticed that you are here and you are carrying Senate Bill 127. It should be on your iPads, or I'm going to call on you, Senator. Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. You please have a seat. And if you'll briefly go over the bill, I know we've seen it twice in subcommittee and it's received favorable passage there.
Thank y'all for letting me be here. It's an honor to be with the House of Representatives. This is Senate Bill 127, which is LC 472163, and it passed unanimously yesterday with no changes out of the subcommittee. So I would just ask favorable treatment here.
And I think we've seen it twice and then favorably considered this out of committee in a House bill as well. So who's 12? Chairman Martin.
I thank you for being here, Senator. I appreciate this. I think you got a good proposition. I just asked for that same favorable treatment for House bills over in Senate Higher Ed.
You know,
I'd say that somewhat in jest.
Did you add Senate Finance to that as well? No, I
you know, Mr. Chairman, I had a feeling he was going to say that.
Next week, we may have more than a feeling to quote the band Boston.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. I see no more questions. What's the will of the committee? I hear a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please signify by stating aye. Opposed, like sign. Registered 1 no. Chairman Martin. Thank you, Senator.
sir.
Appreciate you very
And
much.
Representative Stevens going to carry it for us.
Chairman Stevens,
Yes, sir.
somehow we guessed that.
Thank you. Y'all have a great day.
Thank you. You too. I know y'all, the Senate is going in at 1 p.m. and since we have seen both of these other 2 bills as well in subcommittee, and we will bring these before you, and I'm just gonna. Oh, Senator Goodman is here. Okay, well, please, your turn. Senate Bill 220 passed out of subcommittee yesterday.
I hope I'm not holding y'all up.
No, Mr. Chairman, we're holding you up. I know you'll go in at 1, so you've been with us 3 times now. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm proud to present this bill to those on the committee. This is a policy proposal that comes from Commissioner Tyler Harper's office. Senate Bill 220, the Georgia Farmland Conservation Act. What does this bill include? It includes the creation of the program, it includes the creation of the trust fund, and includes the creation of the council that annually select the properties that participate in the program. The intent of the bill is to establish a purchased agricultural conservation easement program. 29 other states already have programs like this. This bill is modeled after programs that were established in Texas, North Carolina, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. So a PACE program, the other states that have it, there's a dollar for dollar match that comes down from the USDA. USDA allocates $450 million a year to this program. And the match comes, whether it be private dollars that go into the fund, whether it be state or local dollars, it's a dollar for dollar
Chairman
match.
Goodman, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I did have a burning statement or question from somebody on the committee, if you'll allow me.
At the proper time, Mr. Chairman, I say movement do pass.
Bill has a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor, please signify by stating aye. Those opposed, like sign. If you'd like to continue, you may, but I think convinced us
Was it my
in just a few
moonshine
sentences.
that did that?
I think it was showing up 3 times to a House committee and subcommittee meetings that went a long way.
Thank you for this. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Goodman, do you have a House sponsor for this? Okay, Chairman Dickey. The final measure before us is Senate Resolution 214. And Chair's actually worked with GMA, and I know they're here. Ryan, I told the sponsor of the bill that Chairman Ginn, that he did not have to be present today for this joint resolution. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about it, but it really is a joint study committee to discuss service delivery strategy and loss negotiations between the counties and the cities. Why don't you take the stand there and just briefly, I guess, acknowledge that this language is your language and you're comfortable with it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You are correct that we helped craft the language with you on focus on service delivery strategy. We do want to talk about some of the funding involved in that, particularly local option sales tax negotiations. This would have appointments by the speaker and by the lieutenant governor, and would include 2 county commissioners and 2 mayors from counties that will levy a loss. So thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions on this as well.
Thank you. We did make some adjustments so that it didn't speak quite as much to the tax component and more to the negotiations and the delivery strategy. I don't see any questions. What's the will of the committee? Motion do pass in a second. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please signify by stating aye. Opposed, like sign. All right, resolution passes. Thank you very much. And I we'll move on to audit discussions. Your resolution just passed, Chairman. Yeah. Do you have a House sponsor? Or I know you had asked me. Yeah, you may be misaligned a little there, but I'll be happy to try to carry this through on the other side for you, Chairman. Thank you. I know the Department of Audits is here. Mr. Taylor? Did you want to kick us off, or I think most of you know that we had 10 audits that were done, 5 chosen by the House, 5 chosen by the Senate, and Department of Audits has brought in some of their researchers today to give us a little more of a rundown on a couple of those audits. And we appreciate y'all being here. We thank you for the work that you've done and look forward to hearing what else you might have to say.
Have today is the Georgia State University Fiscal Research Center. They actually, can you hear me? Right. Okay, that better? Right. So I'm Matt Taylor with the Department of Audits. As you know, we contracted with 3 universities for these 10 studies. Today, it's the Fiscal Research Center researchers, Georgia State University, and they worked on 5 of the analyses. And I'm just going to turn it over to Dr. Robert Bushman. He's the director at FRC, and he'll get us started and turn it over to the other researchers.
Good afternoon. I'm Bob Bushman. I'm interim director of the Public Finance Research Cluster at Georgia State, of which the Fiscal Research Center is a major part. With me are Peter Bluestone, associate director of the cluster responsible for the Center for State and Local Finance, Carly-Ann Patrick, an associate professor of economics and an affiliated faculty to the cluster, and David Shoquist, professor of economics and affiliated faculty, and also a former director of the FRC. So just really quickly, the order of events here, I'm going to give an overview of the approach to evaluations, followed by a brief introduction to IMPLAN, the economic impact modeling software, followed by reports on the 2 sales tax exemptions, groceries and prescription drugs, the retirement income exclusion, historic rehabilitation tax credit, and the Georgia job tax credit. Very briefly, the requirements in Senate Bill 6 2 years ago included 4 things that necessarily were to be part of these reports: the net change in state revenues, net change in state expenditures, net change in economic activity, net change in other public benefits. So what do these things mean? Net change in revenue is simply the foregone state revenues from the particular tax preference or incentive, less any revenue gains from increased economic activity due to the incentive. We can usually measure foregone revenue directly from tax data in the case of income tax preferences, or estimate it from other economic data in the case of sales and other taxes. Potentially offsetting revenue gains depend on the economic activity that is attributable to the policy, including all of the ripple effects from the initial incentivized activity. Administrative costs can be material, or in some cases, they may be insignificant, depending on the tax preference. But these are reported to us based on information from the responsible agencies. They're covered in the reports, but we're not going to be spending your time on them today. The difficult question in tax incentive evaluations is, what is the economic impact of the behavior you're rewarding or subsidizing through the tax incentive? It's a hard question, not because the calculations are hard. We have tools for that, as you'll hear from Peter. But because it's hard to know whether the behavior you're subsidizing occurred because of the tax incentive or would have occurred anyway. That question of causality is what some refer to as the but-for question. And it can't be answered reliably by simply asking the beneficiary of the tax incentive if their choice would have been different without it. But with good data and methods, we can empirically test whether the policy had an observable effect on the choices of firms or individuals whose behavior the policy is meant to affect. Finally, there may be other public benefits or objectives associated with a tax preference. For example, some tax incentives are targeted to investments in pollution control. I might have skipped something. Wait a second. I'm sorry. Got ahead of myself. With the but-for question answered, as well as the data will allow, we then estimate the overall economic activity arising from the incentivized behavior, which in turn enables us to estimate any revenue gains that may offset some or all of the cost of the incentive. Peter will give a quick overview in a moment of the IMPLAN model that we use to estimate the economic activity that arises, sort of a ripple effect, as I said before, from the initial or direct economic activity, which might be building a factory or a data center or buying a machine, or the boost from hiring more workers that increases output for the firm and their sales. The point I want to emphasize here is that all of the downstream effects of this new direct activity, the ripple or multiplier effects, are all estimated in the economic impacts, whatever some may contend. You will see them in the tables in the reports. What's not in M-Plan or M-Plan type analyses, though, is the opportunity cost of the state spending through the tax code to subsidize economic choices. Because of the state's balanced budget requirements, when you create a tax incentive program, you are directly reducing revenues. And that must be offset. That tax expenditure must be offset by either reducing some other expenditures or raising taxes on someone else. This is where the alternative use of funds comes in. Creating the incentive is a choice with an opportunity cost, the benefits otherwise received from using funds for something else. Whether another tax incentive, a broad tax cut, or spending on education or other budget priorities. We don't want to presume what your budget priorities should be, particular types of spending or which taxes to cut. Each of the myriad of options would have different effects, some shorter term, some longer. So we don't presume a choice, and we're certainly not making any kind of argument for maximizing government revenues as an objective. We're simply saying that unless you actually raised other taxes to pay for a tax incentive, you necessarily cut spending. You made a choice, and any choice has opportunity costs. So having no way of knowing whether the funds would have otherwise gone to education or transportation or health or courts, we assume the alternative use for $1 of tax expenditures is $1 of general fund spending, with roughly 57 cents going to education, 22 to health, 8 to public safety, et cetera, all the way down the budget, as general funds have been appropriated by you all in recent years. We don't say that's what should be done, but we do apply the same methods of estimating the economic and fiscal impacts of that spending that we use for the direct spending from the incentive. And now I will, finally, there may be other public benefits or objectives associated with a tax preference. For example, some tax incentives are targeted to investments in pollution control, public benefit obviously being a cleaner environment for all of us, or to encourage private spending on hospitals, education, cultural amenities, museums, et cetera. Other benefits or objectives might be equity, such as easing the tax burden for families spending on their basic needs for groceries or prescription drugs. Each report discusses these other public benefits that are relevant to that particular tax preference. And now for Peter to give you a brief introduction to M-Plan.
Right. Clicker?
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. M-Plan, everyone's favorite economic modeling tool. So some of the terms that we've used before and you see around a good bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about direct effects, indirect effects, induced effects. So what are those? The direct effects are what we think about as the immediate economic activity, right? When we think about historic rehabilitation tax credit, right? We think construction jobs, right? That's where that goes. That's the direct effect. The indirect effects are from suppliers, people that, are involved with that activity, but in a secondary role. Again, thinking about historic rehabilitation and construction, right? This is lumber, concrete, that kind of thing. So those are the supplier effects. The induced effects are what we think about more traditionally as the ripple effects. These are where, the money that's spent downstream. These are the wages that the workers get from this initial economic activity and the indirect activity. And this is where they spend it, right? This is restaurant meals. This is dry cleaning, going to the movies. Healthcare is in here too, groceries, prescription drugs. Those are all the induced effects. One more term that we use that you'll see a lot in the tables and people use quite a bit is the output, right? And this has a pretty common conception that we think about. It's the value of production or the firm revenues or sales. It's often what you start with in the M-Plan model that generates all these other things, because that's what we can observe. Finally, you hear this term a lot, the multiplier, right? That's that measure of the ripple effect through the economy from that, roughly $1 of initial economic activity. And a vague, there's different definitions of multipliers, but the one you hear most often in this type of work is the multiplier, which is the total economic output, right? Which is the sum of direct effects, indirect effects, and induced effects, divided by that initial direct spending, right? That first initial spending, that initial additional revenue or sales that's linked to the economic activity. So let me show you a table. And this is your typical in-plan output table, not filled in with numbers, but instead filled in with the initials for the types of tax credits that will have these types of effects. And you'll notice that the three effects, direct effect, indirect, and induced, the two tax credits, the jobs tax credit and the historic rehabilitation tax credit, have all of the effects. But the three others, the prescription drugs, groceries, and retirement income, only have the induced effect. And the reason being is that those benefits flow directly to consumers, right? These are benefits that people get when they spend money on groceries, right? On prescription drugs directly from their retirement income. They don't flow through other industry sectors. Again, just thinking about historic rehabilitation, right? That money flows through the construction sector. Then it goes through, concrete or, tax accountants and all that stuff that's associated with business. And then the wages flow through those people spending money in the economy. So that's going to be a difference when we look at these different economic impacts. It matters how they're modeled, right? So that is the high level in-plan. And again, the total effect is the sum of the direct, indirect, and induced. So let me go quickly. I'm going to try to move quickly through these two reports and leave time for some of the others that are a little bit more complicated and a little less straightforward. So this is the, again, economic and fiscal impacts of Georgia's prescription drug and grocery tax exemptions. Brief overview. These have been around a while. Prescription drugs been around since 1984, includes eyeglasses. Note, local sales taxes are exempted as well. The grocery exemption's been around since 1996. This is your food for home consumption. Local sales tax is not exempted here. Locals can charge sales tax on groceries, and they do. Both exemptions have several public benefits. First, it helps lower income households meet their basic needs for food and prescription drugs. And second, it reduces the regressivity of the sales tax, which is generally more burdensome on lower income households. And we're going to have a table here a little bit later that shows that. So real quickly, this is the tax expenditure for prescription drugs in millions. And you can see that the blue bars are the state effect and the red bars are the local. That's how much it's costing the state and local governments. And you can see in the out years, it's the big exemption and it keeps growing. And in the out years, we're talking about combined, over $1 billion. The grocery exemption, again, this is only state dollars, only state sales tax is exempt. And again, in the out years, this is also a big exemption, growing to $1 million $1 billion in the out years. So as I mentioned, these taxes or these benefits flow more directly to lower income households. So you can see the income range there, as well as the mean income. And we've calculated a share if the sales tax were applied, how much of that would be that share of somebody with that income, right? For instance, if you're in the range of less than $15,000 of annual income, your mean income is roughly $7,000. And if you had to pay taxes on your grocery expenditures, that would be roughly 1.7% of your annual income. For prescription drugs, about 1/3% of your annual income. And you can see as income increases, right, those shares go down, right? And the last table, the last column there, when you have income of more than 200,000, right, that's less than 0.1% and even smaller for prescription drugs. So you can see these benefits flow more towards lower income people. Finally, so this is a summary of the state fiscal effects. You'll note that we do have the local expenditure here as well, because those are important when we're calculating the economic impact in terms of the initial economic impact for the expenditure, right? There's benefits that flow through the savings that people receive, as well as the alternate use. And as I mentioned, one of the things about these two exemptions is they only go through the induced effects, right? So when you look at the alternate use, that alternate use is considerably larger, right, than the revenue gains from the economic impact of the expenditures. And the reason being is that part of that is due to, again, the modeling. For the alternate use, we have modeled that through, like Bob said, education spending that flows through schools. Schools have suppliers, right? Indirect effects. And then those wages flow down, from teachers spending money and principals and maintenance workers and all that kind of thing, and those suppliers. So that adds an additional level of ripple effect of multiplier. The same thing, for healthcare, public safety, all those things flow through firms and then have indirect effect and induced effects. So that's why you see the alternate use revenue gains, are substantially larger. That said, the net fiscal effects, again, these are large exemptions, and the net fiscal effects are fairly similar to this tax expenditure cost to the state. So thank you. I'm going to stop there and turn it back over to Bob, and he'll talk about the retirement income exclusion.
Okay, just a quick overview. I'm sure some of y'all are familiar with this. All of you eventually will be. It was first enacted in 1981, allowing people 62 or older to exclude up to $2,000 of retirement income. Since 2012, we've been allowed to exclude up to $35,000 starting at age 62. This is per taxpayer, so twice that for a married couple filing jointly, and $65,000 at age 65. So what is retirement income? It's any income other than earned income. So what is earned income? It's any wages, salaries, tips, or other employer compensation plus net business income from a trade or business engaged in by the individual taxpayer. Anything other than that can be excluded through this provision in the code. You can also exclude up to $4,000 of earned income per taxpayer, starting next year up to $5,000. The motivations for this, providing tax relief for seniors and possibly, only possibly, affecting in-migration of seniors. It's obviously not a business incentive, so it's not fair to evaluate it the same way you would a business incentive. There are other objectives. So you look at things like distributional effects, who benefits from this. Regardless of whether it draws retirees into the state, there is still economic activity, though, that's associated with the additional disposable income that seniors have as a result of this provision. They can spend this in the state on just everyday spending or taking vacations or whatever. And that's economic activity that generates other revenues, sales tax revenues, business tax revenues. So we have to account for that. The magnitude of the tax expenditure, it's one of the largest. It occasionally dips, as you see in 2019, usually related to how the securities markets are doing, how people's investment accounts are doing. They might take less out of their retirement plans if the markets aren't doing well, if their mutual funds are going down. But generally, it grows with the senior population and with the growth in income of the senior population. This graph shows who these people are. Where do they fall in the income distribution? So across the bottom, you've got 5% groups of taxpayers starting at those income levels measured by federal adjusted gross income. And as you can see, that most of the people benefiting from this are in the upper half of the income distribution. That's really not surprising. Retirees have been saving their money all their working lives. And now they have investment income or other income that they are offset or excluding from their taxable income through this provision. This just shows the the size on average for people in those income groups who are eligible for this of their tax savings. The height of the bars, it just represents the middle 50% within each 5% grouping of taxpayers. So there are some people that save more than that, some people that save less, but half of them are within that range. Obviously, people in the upper end of the income distribution benefit more because they have otherwise taxable retirement income. People in the low end of the distribution might depend on more on Social Security, for example, that's exempted elsewhere. It's not part of this. It's already exempted. So this shows the percent of tax liability for the average taxpayer in each of those income groups that is eliminated as a result of this exclusion. So for people around the 25th or 30th percentile, it's nearly their entire tax liability, what they would otherwise owe if it weren't for this exclusion. And it drops off at the high end because these people have other income that isn't excluded by this. And so that gets taxed, and the benefit of this on a relative basis becomes smaller. These are the economic impacts, as Peter already explained. This is through induced effects, the seniors spending their money as consumers in the economy, and all of the ripple effects throughout the economy from that dollar of tax savings changing hands over and over again. We report this with employment, labor income, value added, which is a measure of state GDP, and total output. This is the calculation of the net fiscal effects for state and local governments, starting with the tax expenditure cost, offset to some degree by the revenue gains from the economic activity that results, which is in turn offset by the alternate use of funds, the opportunity cost in terms of potential state and local revenues from the alternate use, and then the net fiscal effects, which as in Peter's examples, is roughly in the neighborhood of the tax expenditure cost itself. The conclusions from this, or the main observations from this, taxpayers over age 62 skew toward higher incomes than younger ones. That's obvious. The median income measured by federal AGI for people age 62 or older in Georgia is about $55,000 compared to about $38,000 for all taxpayers. 70% of the tax savings from this provision accrue to the top income quartile of all filers, and 32% goes to the top 10% of filers. There, as I detail in the report, there's scant empirical support for the retirement income exclusion being a driving factor in senior migration. So what is important? Well, top of the list is cost of living. Climate. We have a very mild temperate climate in Georgia. Geography. We have mountains, coastal cities, urban areas that people might like with amenities that they want. Or, most people when they retire, they either stay where they are or they move home again. Like I grew up in North Carolina, maybe I'd move back there. I know a lot about this retirement income exclusion, so it might influence me more than other people, but but Georgia does rank number 13 for net senior in-migration. Is that because of this tax preference? Well, North Carolina ranks 7th. Idaho ranks 3rd for net in-migration of seniors. Arizona ranks number 1. None of them have an exclusion for private pension or retirement plan income. Number 13, being number 13 on this list, net in-migration rate, if you ever read those sorts of reports, it'll say 2.1. What does that mean? It's 0.21% of the senior population. So in Georgia, that's about 3,000 people moving into the state in 2019. With roughly 500 times that number of people receiving this benefit. Now I'll turn it over to Carly-Ann Patrick for the historic rehabilitation tax credit.
Thank you. So I'll just give you a brief overview. I know most of you are probably familiar, but as a reminder.
I don't mean to interrupt. Would you tell us maybe a little bit more about yourself? I should have asked that of all of you, but tell us your name and you know.
My name's Carly Ann Patrick. I am an associate professor of economics at Georgia State University. I've been there almost 10 years now. And I'm also an affiliate faculty of the Fiscal Research Center. My primary areas of research are the intersection of public finance and urban economics. So these are actually the things I think about a lot. And in my former life, I was a local economic developer. So
Thank you very much.
okay, so thank you. So the way that the Georgia Historic Rehabilitation Tax Credit works is it's an income tax credit for 25%, 30% in targeted areas of qualified rehabilitation expenses. So qualified rehabilitation expenses are expenses that meet standards set up by the National Park Service and the Historic Preservation Division of Georgia to meet certain historical standards and maintain the integrity of the property. In Georgia, we can use this for historic homes, up to $100,000 worth of credit. There was a $5 million program cap for this, and that's going to be in place for 2023 and 2024. And then the program is slated to phase out. This is different than other structures in that the historic homes that receive these benefits are not eligible for the federal historic rehabilitation tax credit. The other historic structures are also eligible for the federal historic tax credit program. The two piggyback on each other. That's why about 60% of the program costs are actually funded through the federal government, administrative costs. So these are, there's a $5 million cap and a $10 million cap, depending on the job creation and sizes of the projects. And there's a $30 million total program cap through 2027, at which time it's slated to phase out. Okay. So when we were doing this evaluation, I wanted to just give you a broad overview of where we were getting our data and how we were thinking about it. For economic activity, we're going to think about the direct economic activity as that which was reported in the DCA detailed project data. So each project files a certification of completion when it is complete with DCA. This certification will get them eligible for the state tax credit as well as for the federal tax credit. It's the same process. And we're going to use that data to create a representative year project of projects. And that is what we're going to feed into InPlan for the direct, indirect, and induced activity associated with two parts. For all of the projects, we're going to have direct activity associated with construction. And we're going to consider the total cost, not just the qualified rehabilitation expenses. And for all of the projects that are not using the home credit, we're going to look at ongoing new activity. So for all other structures. And this, we actually went through the projects themselves for the last few years and got things like market rates for rental housing that are posted for each of these units and the square footage rental rates for the retail spaces. So there's a lot of hand collecting there, but that's how we're going to look at new economic activity there. For fiscal effects, we're going to use the Department of Revenue claims data. And it's important to note that the DCA data on number of projects and amount generated in a fiscal year and the DOR claims data, which is the important part from a fiscal impact status, are not going to be reconcilable in any given year due to two facts I'll show you in just a moment. One of them being timing of the claims. And the two, whether or not, the second one being whether or not they actually ever claim it. So there is differential timing of claims, and then there's do you ever claim it? And then we're going to get revenue from InPlan on that. So here's what I mean. This is the Georgia rehabilitation projects that DCA certified, and it's pooling both of them together. The vast majority of expenditure goes on non-home structures, whereas in terms of number of projects, they're about even in any given year. You do see a big spike in 2016. There was a very large project in 2016 that benefited from the credit in terms of expenditure, but this is for a representative year, we're going to use the average of 2017 to 2019. To give you a sense of the other structure projects and their uses, this just breaks down those other projects by type. And I think it's important to notice that 45% of these projects are housing projects. In other words, they're converting or maintaining structures into market rate or affordable housing, which is a benefit, as I'll note later, that I don't quantify. I can't tell you what having that available is worth, but I think that's worth noting that that's one of the outcomes of the projects that the tax credit supports. Okay. So this is tax provision related activity for the historic homes. And the blue bar is how much is generated in any year. The green bar is how much is claimed. And home credits can be carried forward for up to 10 years. So the red line is the end outstanding balance for that. And you can see that there's a difference between what's generated and claimed by any particular certificate year. This is particularly true for other historic structures, and other historic structure credits cannot be carried forward. They can be sold on the secondary market, but the secondary market for state tax credits is relatively thin. So you'll see that there's quite a big difference between the net number of credits that are generated and those that are ultimately ever claimed. So we get about 61% average utilization on the actual credit. Why would someone go through the process? Well, they're also getting access to the federal credit, right? And have the potential to sell the credit. But there is a big difference between what's generated and what is actually ever utilized. So when we look at the net calculations, the but-for and alternative use are going to be netted out. The trick with the but-for analysis on this is it requires that we separate the activity that is attributable solely to the existence of a state historic rehabilitation tax credit from that which would have occurred otherwise. And so that's not just rehabilitation that would have occurred otherwise without any credits. It's also rehabilitation that would have occurred if there were only the federal historic tax credit, which people all over the country get, right? So we need to net out the effect of the federal HRTC, which is pretty big. And this is also difficult for, I think, most people when they are thinking about how much did tax incentives affect their decision, to separate in their mind, well, the federal part affected this much, the state part affected this much. So we had to come up with a way to do that. The way that we have done it is that we are comparing the number of historic rehabilitation projects in places in Georgia with places in nearby states that do not have a historic tax credit. And we're not just grouping them all together and counting. What we're doing in this but-for analysis is we're saying, here are all the places in Georgia that could have historic rehabilitation projects based on historic structures actually existing, doing the same thing in Tennessee, doing the same thing in in Florida. And then we're matching each one of those places with a companion place in the other location based on socio-demographic characteristics, housing and rent values, and growth trends. So the things we would expect to increase or create impetus for rehabilitation projects. And we're doing that not only in the aggregate, but also by the decade they're built in order to capture the fact that there might be differential demand for historic structures in different places. And we're looking at the shares of historic structures by decade built and matching them, as well as the industry composition. So in other words, we're matching each Georgia place to a place that doesn't have credits in a way that makes them look as close as humanly possible, except for the state credit. And when we do that and then estimate the effect, we find that about 30% of Georgia projects are due to the state credit existing. So it's the differential effect for about 36% of the projects. And what that gives us is the net effects summarized in this table. You can see that we have a substantial amount of labor income coming from construction and value added coming from construction, as well as ongoing economic activity in these places. It does not completely offset the foregone revenue. So you can see in the last kind of panel there, the revenue, the state revenue, foregone revenues about 32 million. We get additional revenue of 23.8. Part of that additional revenue would have happened anyway, so about 15.2. And when we net that out, it's costing about 23.8 million in state funds. Factor in the alternative use we've already discussed, and it's $26 million expenditure that's supporting this type of activity. What this doesn't address, and I think it's important to note that that 26 million does support other benefits that aren't necessarily captured in the fiscal return, are the amenity and cultural values of historic preservation. I can't say how much people value that or how important that is. What we have not done here is think about the change in nearby property values, but there is some evidence that having rehabilitation projects as opposed to demolition projects for structures that need maintenance or have deteriorated increases nearby property values. So there would be some benefit from that we have not quantified. That was sort of beyond the scope of this project. Nor have we tried to quantify the effect of the program as a housing policy that might be a mechanism providing market rate or affordable housing, nor the effect if we have sort of one big catalyst project, which there have, I think, been examples of that are sort of unique that have taken advantage of the program.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You ready?
Yeah, yes, sir. Again, if you don't mind just sharing, a little bit about yourself and.
I'm Dave Schulquist, professor of economics. I'm a former director of the Fiscal Research Center for about 12 years. I'm semi-retired, so I do part-time work at Georgia State, also affiliated with Fiscal Research Center. So I'm going to talk to you about the Georgia Job Tax Credit. I assume everybody has some familiarity with it, but let me highlight the key factors in the program. For about a little more than half of the counties, only jobs created in selective industries are eligible. Each year, the counties are ranked based upon their economic conditions by the Department of Community Affairs to form 4 tiers from good counties to not so good counties. The credit amount varies by tier from $750 per new job to $3,500 per new job. There is a required minimum number of jobs that must be created before the firm is eligible to take the credit. And that number ranges from 2 jobs to 25 jobs. The credit can be taken up for 5 years as long as the job is maintained. So here's the tax expenditure. The last blue column is 2022, and it's $270 million. This is the cost of the state in tax revenues for actual credits taken including credits taken for jobs that were created in prior years. So it's not just the current jobs, it's all jobs that were eligible and continue to be eligible. The data we use for the analysis comes from the Department of Revenue. It's hard because their data is set up to do audits and so forth, not this kind of work. So we had to deal with them a while to get some numbers. But this is the activity. These are the jobs that were credited, that earned a job tax credit, not necessarily that took the job tax credit that year. So in 2019, about 23,000 new jobs were credited. And the tax credit was about $66 million, a little bit more than in 2020. To give you some perspective, in Georgia, the jobs growth in between 2018 and 2019 was about 103,000 jobs. So about a fifth of the jobs were credited. We used 2019 data because we were afraid that using 2020 with the COVID, that the numbers might be kind of suspect. So there are two questions that you have to address if you want to do this analysis, as was suggested. First is, what is the but-for? What is the effect of this on job creation? And second, what is the economic effect of those jobs? So the first thing we do then is the but-for analysis. And what we use what we call a decisive percent, which is the percent of jobs that earned a credit that were created because of the credit. So it's sort of 1 minus the but-for. And that's a key because that really kind of drives the results. We use several sources to come up with a number. Basically a literature search. There are three studies of Georgia's job tax credit. One was created by Dagny Falk back in about 2000. Another was a dissertation published in 2016 by Kuhn. And then the study that I published in 2021 with co-authors, published in 2021, that looks at a variety of ways, looked at the job tax credit and what effect it has. And we looked at it every way from Sunday. And what we concluded was there was no statistically significant effect. We don't want to claim that there was no effect, there was no statistically significant effect, but this possibility that there was some effect. And so what we say is that there's little or no evidence that the job tax credit created new jobs. So then we relied on a survey by Tim Barkick of the decisive percentage. He did a survey of the literature, some 31 studies, looked at studies based upon their quality, because you can always find a study that shows what you want it to show. But you got to look at it and say, does this really make sense? Is this a good study, or is this a biased study? And so he did this, he took out the biased studies and found of the remaining studies, the average decisive percent was 6.3%, with a median of 3.4. And he says that the reasonable upper bound estimate is 11.4%. The fiscal affairs or fiscal office of Pennsylvania also did a survey, and they find that the range is from 2% to 8%, so much smaller than Bartek. Pennsylvania and Maryland did a study similar to this, that they use 5%. So we use 5%. It's consistent with the report, the research that I've done. And then we use 11.4% as an alternative, which is Bartek's reasonable upper bound. Now, if you take 10% of the jobs that were created, or 11.4% of the 26,000 jobs that were credited, that's about $2,600 jobs. So that's the number of jobs that were created. 5%, about half of that. Okay. So the economic effects are run through M-Plan. So here's the value added and the output. For comparison, for Georgia, the value added total for the state, it's about $692 billion. So $265 million is large in absolute terms, but small relative to the size of the state. In terms of jobs, the using 11.4% decisive factor, the total effect on jobs would be 2,600 jobs that were created. That's a multiplier effect of about 2.25. The revenue effects come out of in-plan. So here's the revenue effects for state, local, and total. And then there's the program cost, which includes the cost of the credits plus administrative costs, which we've estimated to be about $300,000. We did some ballpark estimates from using in-plan output, economic output numbers, and find that these numbers on revenue are fairly consistent. They seem reasonable. This is probably a more compelling number. This is the return on investment. So we took estimated revenue, subtract the estimated cost to find net revenue, and then divided that by estimated cost to get return on investment. And we did that for state revenue, state and local revenue, and for the two alternative decisive factors. And you'll see that the rate of return is negative and large in all cases. We did some other work, calculated the present value of the fiscal effect. The jobs credit stop after 5 years. Some of the jobs stay in place. And we did some estimates and found that about 43% of jobs are still in place after 10 years, but not all jobs, less than half. And so we did a present value of 10 years, so 5 with credit, 5 without, and the revenue loss is still large and negative. We also thought, well, what's really critical is the decisive factor. And so we figured out, well, what's the decisive factor have to be to break even? Revenues equal expenditures. And so if you simply look at state revenue, you have to have a decisive factor, which is twice our upper estimate. So almost 28%. If you're doing state and local revenue, the break even is somewhat less than that. And then we looked at alternative use. This is similar to what other people have done. See that value added and output are smaller than when you use the job tax credit, and revenue is much, much less than when you use output, when you look at when you look at the effect of the job tax credit. I don't have a slide, but I also looked at the potential benefits. So the big benefits would be that someone could be unemployed for could be unemployed for a smaller amount of time. So someone who might have been unemployed for 6 months because of the job tax credit gets a job in 6 weeks. There's a benefit to that. It's also possible that someone would get a better job because of the job tax credit. And so there's a value to that. And there's also additional jobs in low-income communities, which has a social benefit to the state. On the other hand, there's cost. And new jobs might require new infrastructure and might also require additional general government expenditures. But we didn't try to estimate those. It's difficult and fraught with problems. So that's my presentation, and we're open for questions. We're going to sit up here.
Sure, that'd be fine. We'll see if we, have any questions for you. I know we're competing against March Madness here, and I did double check to make sure that the Blue Devils didn't play until later this evening. Dr. Bushman, we know we'd probably lose you otherwise. Are there any? That's right. Are there any questions? Okay, start with Representative Holcomb.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I graduated from Carolina, so I have all the time in the world this spring. Let's start with that. With respect to, thank you for your presentations. They were very interesting, and I do have a couple of questions. So with respect to not finding any statistical significance, is the takeaway that we can't say that we're creating any new jobs through the tax credit? Is that fair to say?
Results. And it's not, you know, there's no problem, there's a probability that the job was created is below some minimum level.
Okay, right. Is that just with randomness, we would probably get the same result,
Right.
correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then with respect to the tax on groceries, it does strike me that with that one seems to be working in that the benefits do seem to be going to the lowest end of the economic scale. And I think it was 1.7% or 0.1.
Yeah, 1.6, 1.7, yeah.
Roughly. And if an individual is making, say, $15,000, that's roughly $250, which is probably material for them to buy groceries, to have food security, et cetera. So that one is kind of interesting. And then the last one that I'd like to comment on and then maybe get some feedback on is on the retirement tax credit. It does seem like most of the advantages are going to the right side of the curve in terms of incomes, so wealthier people. Are there any states that impose a limit in terms of they have the tax credit for certain incomes of retirement and then they cut it off at, say, 100,000, 150,000, things like that?
I'm not aware of any that have a phase out if you're above a certain income level, but there are a wide range of caps, and there are certain types of retirement income that might be fully excluded without a limit in a few states, where other types of income that people might have when they're retired are taxed. There's so much variation, but there are, I think, 41 states, which is all but one that have an income tax, have some kind of exclusion of income for seniors. It might just be public pensions and Social Security, railroad retirement income, things like that everybody exempts. There's not any kind of income limit on other than the cap itself for the individual.
Got it.
Phase out above a certain income level in each state.
Okay, thank you.
And if I could add, mention, in the presentation, the reality is that that's where seniors are in income. Most, they're in the upper half of the income distribution because they've saved their money all their life to retire, and they have income from it. That's the fact of life.
Representative Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one housekeeping question. I was just going to see if maybe we could have this presentation made available to us. It was a lot to soak in a short amount of time. And so I was just hoping to have some time to maybe review it and look through it and maybe have some other questions, but just a basic one to y'all and see if, in terms of effectiveness of the credit, could you rank the four that we just discussed? 5, excuse me. That's why I need the PowerPoint, Mr. Chairman.
They're not all comparable because they are meant for different purposes. The 2 sales tax exemptions and retirement income exclusions aren't business incentives. So like I said, it's not really fair to score them the same way. We did the economic impact and the net physical effects for them because SB 6 requires it. But they exist for other reasons besides being an incentive program. Except to the extent that you might entice seniors to move here or to stay here when they retire. The other 2, I don't know if y'all want to comment.
Given that I'm over 65, I think the senior exemption is the most important. But as an economist, I don't want to make those policy decisions. So I have not thought about that. I think that's really something the General Assembly needs to talk about. So I don't have a real opinion on it.
Thank you.
Chairman Knight.
The slide with the food, the food credit.
Yes, okay.
That's fine right there. So when we talk about these calculations and we're talking about, you know, a tax share of income, if this credit wasn't there, and there's been several comments made as far as, you know, they're doing what they need as far as the lower income, you know, individuals in the state. Did you, in your calculations, put in that maybe these lower individuals had other benefits that were actually paying for food into your calculation?
Yes, these exclude the federal benefits.
So
If they're getting WIC, for instance, or SNAP or something like that, these are excluded from
so
the expenditure costs.
so you did take that into account.
Yes.
Okay. And I was starting to say the same thing on healthcare with prescriptions, with, you know, Medicaid and other programs that are out there that are
Yes,
providing benefit.
what we look at are out-of-pocket expenses, for instance, for insurance or deductibles and things like that, but not any benefits that are paid by the federal.
Okay. So I was just wondering, because I know regarding the grocery tax, I mean, the benefit through the EBT, you know, the food stamp program is close to $400, if I'm not mistaken, per person. That's the monthly benefit.
Right, so yes, so that's excluded from again, the total tax expenditure. These numbers for the tax expenditures come out of the tax expenditure.
Yeah.
So a typical spend, you know, of someone at that income level, that would not be an alternative benefit. The out-of-pocket spend for somebody in that income range.
Yes.
Typical
Yes,
spend.
yes. These income numbers are generated from BLS.
Chairman Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What we don't know, I guess, and I'm looking more at the jobs tax credit and even the enhanced jobs tax credit is, for example, Hyundai with its 5 billion investment, Caterpillar with $1 billion, Baxter with $1 billion. We don't know in those negotiations with Pat Wilson and those companies what that meant in closing the deal, do we? We just know the return on the investment to the taxpayer.
Correct.
I had one, you want to go ahead if you'd like.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Stevens' question reminded me of a question that I wanted to ask but forgot. And your methodology seemed to be very quantitatively focused. And to that end, is there a way to do a qualitative component of surveying some of those in terms of their decision making? Is that possible, and would it be helpful?
You could do a survey. I would not want to rely on that survey. You're asking people who benefit from the tax credit, whether they think the tax credit is important. And so you're not sure what kind of answer you're going to get.
Well,
And the decision to hire somebody is a multifaceted decision, right? It's not run just by the job tax credit. So to say that this was due to the job tax credit and I wouldn't have hired them without it, it's difficult.
I understand. Thank you.
Williamson.
So I was just wondering, getting back to the job tax credits, the gross number that y'all were calculating on, did that frankly, this member did not realize that nonprofits were availing themselves of using job tax credits and applying it towards their payroll withholding. Did you look at the nonprofit space in that calculation?
nonprofits don't have taxes, so they can't get the credit.
Well, unless I stand corrected, they have been taking the credit because they do.
There are some of the job credits, I mean, they'll have many of them. There are some jobs credits that can be used to offset withholding liabilities.
Correct.
That's the case for this one, but it's in the tax expenditure numbers. It's in what DOR reports as far as utilization of the credit. In fact, they have a report that itemizes it by the tax that it's applied to. And for some of the credits, you'll see withholding, payroll withholding on there. I
Correct.
just don't recall right offhand if this is one of those.
Correct. Okay. Thank you.
Is Dr. Patrick? And, question may be for you. I just, on the historic tax credit, do we look at that, maybe how it's implemented in states where they just mirror what the federal credit is like, as we do maybe in certain other instances here with other credits?
So, the report does contain a breakdown of what other states do, and it's sort of all over the place. We did not compare, so there actually was not reliable evaluations of many other states for which us to compare performance of ours relative to states that structure it slightly differently. The other structures program here in Georgia is very, very similar to the federal program. So they really are sort of a piggyback. It is what is unique in Georgia. Some other states do it, but unique relative to the federal program is the emphasis on private residential homes, which, has benefits and costs, like we've said, but one of those benefits may be preserving existing housing stock rather than it being demolished. But there really aren't reliable. Yeah, let's go with reliable.
Well,
Reliable evaluations of other states.
well, I guess where I was headed with that is, you mentioned affordable housing, and, the fact that rehabilitation could move in concert with, potentially affordable housing if it were handled the right way. And we have such a limited amount that's going towards the historical tax credit. And I just didn't know where that might could go in the grand scheme of things, but maybe an offline discussion if you're amenable to it.
Mentioned it because even though the return on investment from a net fiscal standpoint is negative, that doesn't mean this isn't paying for other things that might be useful that you should consider. And I'm not sure if you spent this money in other ways where you would get it, if your idea is, or if you want to do affordable housing or preservation, you spend it in a different way to achieve those same objectives, that you could do it as effectively.
Well, it's kind of a multiplier, you're
Yeah.
taking, potentially blighted area, and you're not only rehabilitating it, but you're providing housing in conjunction with that.
And a number of historic factories in the data have taken advantage of that to turn into housing and apartment, both market rate and affordable.
Thank you.
And I think we need probably a little bit more in-depth study to know exactly how much affordable housing is being produced in the state.
Those instances. Thank you. Back to
Yeah, and I think you touched on it, Chairman Blackman. One of the positives about the Georgia Historic Housing Tax Credit Program is it has helped create almost a renaissance in a lot of small towns in Georgia, which you have to look at the effect that does have on those small communities. You think Madison was a stellar example of homes being renovated over in that area. Now, whether or not that was all driven by the housing tax credit program, and I'm not sure. I don't have that deep of knowledge about that, but I do know for a fact that it has helped kickstart renovations in many of the smaller towns in Georgia. On the other hand, looking at in particular the Georgia Housing Tax Credit Program, it does strike me, I don't know if the slide's still available, but the underutilization, they're qualifying for more credits than it's being taken down, which implies to me that we're either offering too much credit that they don't need, or we could reallocate it in some way, shape, or form to have a more desired outcome.
So I-
That's what it strikes me as. It appears to me, or is it's all being driven, or you said 66% of it's being driven by the federal tax credits.
At that and general economic forces, right? Because there are preferences for people have preferences for living historic buildings that the market would respond to, period, right? Without a tax credit. The question is whether it would be the same market rate. So I struggled and spent probably more time than I should have trying to reconcile why people went through the entire process of getting certified, working with DCA, making sure these were legitimate renovations, even filing the paperwork with the Department of Revenue and then not ultimately claiming them. But there are, I think, two major reasons why this occurs. One, you have to make the decision about what you're going to do on the rehabilitation project prior to learning your tax liability in the future, right? And so this offsets a tax liability in the future. And it also makes you eligible for the federal credit if it's an income producing property. So you make the decision, you factor it in, and then you realize your tax liability, right? If you have no realized tax liability for other reasons, then you can't claim the credit. If it's for other structures, you can try and sell it on the secondary market. But as we learned with the low income housing tax credit, the secondary market for state income tax credits is not particular, it's pretty thin. So I'm not sure if I'd say that it doesn't make a difference or you're offering too much as there is this difference in the timing. It does suggest that there is some portion for which it's not decisive, right? And our best estimate of that was 36% of them are decisive.
I don't see any more questions, so I appreciate you taking your Thursday around lunchtime and afternoon to share with us, and we may see you back at some point, I guess. Does anybody have anything else? Any members of the committee? I don't see any lights. So without anything further, I wish y'all a great afternoon and happy St. Patrick's Day. Meeting adjourned.